Welcome back. We've been looking at a couple of different types of heresies in the early church in the late 3rd century. And now we're going to transition to the most serious heresy, and the one which will take us a little bit longer to develop and explain, and actually is something that, again, is in some respects still around in some places. And so we will need to make sure that we know exactly what this heresy is and how the early church dealt with it. That heresy is, as you can see there, Arianism. And we're going to be talking about Arianism and the response to Arianism for the next several lectures. And so let's jump into it here. As you can see on the previous slide, this heresy is actually develops over a couple of different phases. The first phase took place before and up to the Council of Nicaea in 325, and the second phase took place after that council up to the Council of Constantinople in 381. So these, it's pretty much the whole of the 4th century was taken up in this particular debate, one way and another. There were other things happening, but this is the most serious. Phase 1 dealt with the views of Arius and Eusebius of Nicomedia, not to be confused with Eusebius of Caesarea, the historian. And Phase 2 was a bit more complicated, and that's putting it mildly, with some who thought pretty much like Arius and others who adjusted Arius' teaching, called semi-Arians and other technical names. We'll just call them all Arians. And this debate, again, occupied a number of minor councils and a number of major historians or theologians, and we'll be looking at them. Phase 1 of this particular heresy began when this North African priest named Arius, who gave his name to the whole trouble, and particularly the first era, the first phase. He was born about 250 AD, and again, apparently in Libya, although it's uncertain. He might have been a more Greco-Roman type individual. We're not really sure. But he was, in all probability, a student of Lucian of Antioch, so he probably came from that area and just moved to North Africa. He became a deacon in that city. But sometime between 318 and 323, Arius came into conflict with his bishop, who was named Alexander of Alexandria, and there's several of those guys. Again, sorry for the confusion, this is just history. And the debate was over the nature of Christ. Now again, don't forget that they were dealing with these other heresies at the same time, and so it appears that Arius' views were really a reaction against Sabellianism, as we'll see. Arius was not a young man when this controversy began in 318 AD, and he didn't do much writing. He was more of a popular preacher, and he actually conveyed his theology in catchy songs and poetic verses. His main work was titled Thalia, which means banquet, and most of it's just verse, easily memorized by people and easily passed on to others as well. Controversy began when Arius apparently decided that he needed to challenge Alexander over a sermon. A lot of conflict in church happens when one theologian or pastor decides to challenge another pastor or theologian over a sermon or a message. But Alexander had delivered a message to the clergy under his authority. Now, again, it's not altogether clear exactly what Alexander said at the time, because it's not recorded directly from that particular lecture. We have subsequent reminders of that lecture, but they may have been edited. So anyway, a historian named Socrates Scholasticus, you can still get his history, said this: Alexander, in the fearless exercise of his functions for the instruction and government of the church, attempted one day in the presence of the presbytery, that's all the other bishops and elders, and the rest of the clergy, to explain with perhaps too philosophical minuteness the great theological mystery of the unity of the Holy Trinity. So again, this is what we've been dealing with. Socrates goes on to say, a certain one of the presbyters under his jurisdiction, whose name was Arius, possessed of no inconsiderable logical acumen. That may not have been a statement by Socrates of praising Arius. That may have been sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing. Imagine that the bishop was subtly teaching the same view on this subject as Sabellius the Libyan. So you can see that what Arius is reacting against is what he sees is the heresy of Sabellianism. Socrates goes on, Arius, from the love of controversy, took the opposite opinion to that of Sabellius, and as he thought, vigorously responded to what was said by the bishop. So again, this is Arius listening to Alexander, who he thinks is saying things like Sabellius. If, said he, the Father begat the Son, he that has begotten had a beginning of existence. And from this it is evident that there was a time when the Son was not. And you can just highlight that phrase because that becomes the catchphrase for Arius in this early phase of Arianism. There was a time when the Son was not. If that's the case, continuing to reason here, it necessarily follows that he had the same substance from nothing, that his ousia was out of nothing. Now you might say, well, that sounds odd, but what he's really saying there is since we believe the Bible, and it does teach creation out of nothing, God created everything out of nothing, he thinks that basically the Son was from the same source, created out of nothing. And basically, again, the point is there is a time when the Son was not. He's not eternal like the Father is. Several notes about Arius. Arius, not just his logical acumen, as Socrates was saying, but he was a thoroughgoing Greek rationalist. So he had imbibed very deeply of Platonic philosophy and rationalistic philosophy. Basically, human beings have the ability to reason it out for themselves, and if it's not reasonable, then we should question it. We might think that is a very modern sort of thing, but it goes all the way back to the Greeks. Furthermore, Arius presented himself, again, as opponent of heresies, as we've already said, from Gnosticism to Sabellianism. So these fellows thought that they were actually defending orthodoxy, or what they viewed as orthodoxy. Theologically, he seems to have been tremendously concerned to preserve the monarchy, again, that the unity, the singularity, the monarchy, the rulership of the Father. But he also recognizes that the Son is not the Father, versus Sabellianism. So what is the relationship between the Son, the Father, and the Son? What we might say that Arius began with, again, a simple question. What does it mean for God to be God? And according to Arius, the answer is simple. God is simple. And by simple, he means what Plato and Aristotle and the Greek philosophers meant. And it simply means that God is simply God. In his, remember the terms we introduced before, in his substance, in his essence, in his own existence, he has no parts. He's just God. The only part of God that is God himself. There's nothing greater. There's nothing bigger, stronger. There's no being that he is changing into. And all other being derives their creation, their existence from him. Well, once God is defined this way, Arius has to decide whether Jesus is God. And if he answers it, no matter how he answers it, what sort of God? But for Arius, whatever that answer would be, what sort of God, whether it's that logos again or some other divine existence we've already talked about, he certainly wouldn't be God in the same sense as the Father. Dr. Brown suggests it appears that Arius was motivated by an elitist desire for understanding God, more sophisticated than that of those who simply repeated orthodox formulas. In other words, he wanted to sort of have a rational understanding of God. Arius taught that this eternal unbegotten God, that would be the Father, created a Son, and thus the Son is a created being. God begat an only begotten Son before eternal times. He made him exist at his own will, unalterable and unchangeable. It certainly seems like it's trying to accord the Son a high level of respect, but it's diminishing him by saying that he was created. Arius taught this created Son was a perfect creature, but not as one of or like the other creatures. He was a perfect offspring, but not as one who is begotten. One of those things is begotten. At the will of God, he was created before times and before ages, and gained life and being from the Father. Despite granting the Son this level of uniqueness, Arius maintained that the Son is nonetheless a created being. This meant that for Arius, there was a time when the Son did not exist. So again, that was his little catchphrase. As Arius himself writes in a letter to Alexander, trying to explain himself, the Son, being apart from time by the Father, and being created and founded before ages, did not exist before his generation. So accordingly, the Son is not eternal or co-eternal or co-unoriginate with the Father. So these are the objections. You can see that the problem there is Arius has a little bit of difficulty trying to understand how things worked, if we can use that language, in eternity past. Whenever somebody's trying to figure out how things worked in eternity past, you can pretty much guess that there's going to be some misunderstandings. Oops. Arius reasoned, if Jesus was begotten of the Father, then that makes the Father greater in power, prior in time, whatever that meant, in the time before time. Again, Arius' refrain, again, there was a time when the Son was not. I think that's the third time I've mentioned that, so that should show up in your summaries. If the Son was begotten, then that can't mean the same thing for the Father, because the Father wasn't begotten. And it can't mean the same thing as it does for an earthly father and son. So that any physical element of physical fatherhood has to be eliminated when we're talking about the Father and the Son. So for Arius, that meant the Son must have been created. Sorry, technical glitch there. The key here is that the term for begottenness and the term for created look very much alike in Greek, genetos. And you can see it there. Begotten is genetos. It's pronounced the same way with two N's in the middle of the slide there. And then genetos, created, is with one N. And again, this is part of the issue that we're going to see. Terminology is what becomes most confusing. The distinction between the Father and the Son enabled Arius to fit the two persons into the Platonic scheme, keeping the Father as the good in that upper realm that we've talked about before, untouched by any direct contact with the created world, as the Gnostics would have it. But the Father created the Son, or Logos, perfectly, and then the Logos is the one who created the physical world. But again, this is all predicated on the assertion there was a time when the Son was not. So another implication for Arius was that the Son had a different nature than the Father, and that the Son is heterousios, from heteros in Greek, or of a different kind of substance, not homoousios. And I know that this is confusing, and I don't want you to be confused, but understanding these terms is fairly important. You might want to just study this particular slide very carefully. Homoousios means of the same substance. Homoiousios means of a similar substance. If you're looking at the slide carefully, you can see. If you don't know Greek, ignore the Greek word there, but you can see the top term there in the green, homoousios, is of the same substance, but there's a change in the second one, homoiousios. You can see a iota or an I right between the two omicrons or O's in the second word there. There's one letter difference. That's the Greek iota. And it's an amazing sort of thing to think that there was that much confusion over just one letter, but there certainly was. Arius believed that if the Father and the Son shared the same essence, and if the Son received that nature from the Father, then it would mean that the Father is compounded, divisible, and alterable and material. In other words, he's not simple. But for Arius, that can't be, because by definition, God is not like that. He's one. He's immutable. Or back to a previous slide, he's simple, and he's spirit. So it cannot be that the Father is sharing anything like his essence with the Son. That's his rational. So a summary of his errors: when the reports of Socrates, Sozomen, and Theodoret, all ancient historians, are taken together, a consensus about the main themes of his theology, Arius's theology, emerges. And these are: 1, Arius taught that the Son was begotten and therefore had a beginning. Essentially, it means he's a created being. 2, that since God the Father is unbegotten, the Son is not of the same substance of the Father. So unbegottenness of the Father, begottenness of the Son, means there has to be two different types of being. And 3rd, that the Son is a creature. Again, that stems from the fact that he's created, albeit a special creature who enables Christians to become children of God. And there's just a tinge of sort of Gnostic thinking in that as well. Based on this general consensus, it seems possible to speak of Arius's views of having 3 trajectories that resonated. First is that Arianism was a kind of a radical monotheism. Like, you probably have already seen that. There's one God, he's simple, he can't have a rival, so to speak. Second, Arianism has been presented and understood as a way of understanding the complex relationship of the Father and the Son. And this goes back all the way to the time of origin. And again, this is what we've been saying, what we said in the last lecture. All we're trying to do here, again, if this is really complicated for you, just keep in mind, all we're trying to say here is they looked at the Bible, they saw that there's one God, there's 3 persons, and how do we answer that? How does that work? Well, Arius's answer is that this relationship was one of subordination, that the Father is superior and the Son is subordinate. And finally, that Arianism has been understood as from the standpoint of the implications it has in its approach to Christian salvation. Why is all this so important? Well, the point is that, as we're going to see in later history, if Jesus is not God, then how could he have died for our sins? And they saw this early on here, although that wasn't the focus of the debate just yet. The question here is Jesus God? And before we can answer how that affects salvation, we'll have to decide that question for sure. And that's what these debates in the 4th century were really all about. Well, Arius needed to be opposed and refuted. Those who opposed Arius's views were Alexander of Alexandria, as we've already seen, and the real champion of opposing Arius was Athanasius. Athanasius of Alexandria, and we're going to talk more about him in upcoming lectures. His views, that is Arius's views, were condemned at the Council of Nicaea in 325, and that's where the first Nicene Creed is going to be articulated. And we're going to talk more about that in a future lecture, and so we won't get into that just now. Well, once again, we come to the end of this lecture. I know that there have been some fairly technical aspects to this, and some of that terminology, homoousios, you can hear my way I articulate it makes a distinction there, is complicated. I've had people in my church ask me, do I really need to know this? And my answer is, well, I think you don't need to know it unless you're taking a class from me. But you folks are taking a class from me. So you really do need to know this. It really is important. it's something that we need to know as Christians and understand how we got to the creeds that we believe are the Orthodox creeds of the Church. So we'll be continuing on with this particular topic in the next couple of lectures. See you then.